Hi everyone, just a quick reminder that if you want to follow along the journey of making this dress in real time with me, both on Instagram and YouTube, then please consider supporting me on Patreon. You get to choose how much to pledge per month, and you will receive live updates both on my close friends' Instagram stories and access to all of the YouTube videos right now. Hope you enjoyed the video. So this is the very first video in my new making of series, and if you couldn't tell from the intro, I am making Aurora's wedding dress from the Disney live-action movie Maleficent, Mistress of Evil. If you want to find out more about which concept art I will be basing my dress off and more, then please watch the first live-action Aurora project announcement video. I'll link it in the cards right now, as well as in the description box below. This video is about making the corset. It won't be as detailed as my other videos about making corsets, so if you want more detail, please see the description box below for those videos. Also, this video is just one way of making a corset, and it's my way through my learnings through watching YouTube videos combined with what I personally like to do. If you don't like the way I do it, then don't watch. Okay, so that's a bit of background info out of the way. Now, speaking of the pattern I am using, this is my first time not using my self-drafted corset pattern. I actually wanted to try something a little bit different this time, and I used one of Urania Black's free PDF patterns. I used the Dolores pattern with slight adjustments just to suit my preference. For my fabric, I decided to go with a basic calico material from Spotlight. Make sure to add your seam allowance when you are using this pattern. I added about 2 centimeters to all of my pieces, except for the center back where I added a little extra just in case. Time to cut out all the pieces. As you would have seen, I fold my fabric twice, which means I can cut all 4 layers at once. This isn't recommended since it means that the pieces might shift as you cut, and therefore they may vary in shape, but I'm lazy and I don't mind cutting my pieces this way. Once all the pieces have been cut, it's crucial to number all of the pieces and mark where the waistline is, which way is up, and any other important markings as written on the pattern pieces, such as boning channels or notches. Now it's time to start assembling the corset pieces together. Starting with the center piece, which I label as number 1, I then find the side front pieces, aka the number 2s, and pin them to the center front piece, making sure to align the waistline marking first and then pinning outwards from there. Once pinned, simply sew along the pin line. Repeat this process for all pattern pieces, twice might I add, because this is a double layer corset, and yeah, that's what we're making here. You should have a set of panels sewn together for the outer layer, or the fashion layer as I like to call it, and then the same thing for the lining. Iron open flat all of the seams on both the fashion layer and the lining. I then like to help keep the seams open flat by top stitching down either side of each of the seams. I sew just a couple of millimeters away from the original seam on both the right and left side of the seam to secure the seam allowance. Next up, trim the seam allowances down quite close to the top stitching, but don't cut into it of course. We just want to remove any of the bulk that might be caused from the seam allowance. Now I'm installing what's called a waist stay or a waist tape. This is essentially a piece of non-stretch cotton tape used to uphold the majority of the tension when the corset is worn. It is recommended to use cotton grosgrain ribbon, but Spotlight unfortunately only sells polyester grosgrain ribbon, so I usually just go for the cotton tape, which isn't grosgrain. I like to get the one that's about 2 to 2.5 centimeters wide. Attach the cotton tape at the waistline markings at each seam and make sure that the waist tape lies flush against the fabric as you pin. Sew in the ditch at each seam to secure the waist tape. I like to do back stitches to make sure the waist tape is extra secure. Next, lay the fashion layer on top of the lining layer and try to match the seams as best as possible. You saw how I cut my pieces such that it's inevitable that my pieces won't match up, so I'm not too worried about matching seams. No one sees the corset anyway, so it doesn't have to be pretty. Pin along each of the seams. Usually I would stitch in the ditch across each of the seams to secure the two layers together, but since I wanted to try something a bit different this time, I instead stitched either side of the original seam. This means that the boning will be placed a few millimeters away from the original seams, which is different to what I usually do. Usually I have the boning right up against one another at the seams. I think doing it the way that I have done so in this video is a lot stronger, but it does take a little bit longer to do. Obviously, repeat this for all seams. Now to close off the centre back panels. I simply fold the raw edge under and then do a few rows of top stitching to secure all the layers together. Just make sure to measure across the whole corset laid out flat along the waistline to make sure it's the correct size. I also sew the boning channels at this stage as well. Because it's a double layer corset, the boning channels are really easy to do. I just sew next to the lines I sewed to secure the corset layers together, and voila, there are my boning channels. Next, I sew all across the bottom edge of the corset to close off the boning channels. As for the top edge, I just trim that down to my liking. I prefer a mid or underbust corset as opposed to overbust corsets. The Dolores pattern that I used is an overbust, so I just trimmed that excess fabric off. Now I'm putting in the eyelets. These are just the basic pack of eyelets that you can buy from Spotlight. They're not fancy, nor are they very durable or strong, so if you are going to use them, I'd suggest hand sewing the eyelets in afterwards. Yes, I know I could buy other more high quality eyelets online or something, but I'm too lazy for that. I'd much rather just pop into the local store, even if they do tend to have less than ideal supplies. Insert all of the boning into the channels. As you would know by now, I use cable ties from Bunnings. Make sure to round the edges when trimming the cable ties to the right length. You don't want any sharp pointy bits. There is also the option of sanding down the edges with sandpaper, but again, I'm too lazy for that. Once all the boning is in, sew along the top edge of the corset to block off the boning channels so no boning can escape. Trim off the excess seam allowance off the bottom and top edges of the corset, and finally apply bias binding to encase the raw edges. I'm assuming you know how to apply bias binding, but if you don't, go watch my other corset videos linked in the description below, which go into more detail about this. Oh, and here's me attempting to show you the hand stitching I did around the eyelets to properly secure them into place. If I didn't do this, then the eyelets are bound to rip out. And we're done! Here's the final corset. If you want to know how I lace it, then go check the description box for the Sydney Aline diagram I always use. I think the corset worked out great, especially since I didn't do a mock-up. I would highly recommend Arania black corset patterns if you are interested, but after making this one, I find that my self-drafted corset pattern that I usually use, the one that I used for Jasmine and Midnight Masquerade Aurora, is a tad more comfortable. This one's still perfectly fine, and it's just what I need for my new live action Aurora dress. Speaking of which, we will dive into the making of that dress over the next many months. So patrons, you would have already seen all of the real-time Instagram stories and YouTube sewing vlogs of the making of the dress, but for the rest of you, stay tuned. It's going to be a long journey.